The television cast its pale blue glow across the living room, painting everything in that familiar late-night hue I had grown to associate with solitude. The movie was something forgettable, one of those thrillers Julian had picked from the discount bin at the grocery store. We had made it a ritual of sorts, these Friday evenings when Clara would retire early with her book and her tea, leaving us to our beer and whatever film we could find. I sat on the couch where I always sat, in the spot worn soft by years of my body settling into the same position night after night. Julian occupied the other end, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the detergent from his shirt. The house felt heavy around us, thick with the quiet that comes when children have finally surrendered to sleep and wives have retreated to their separate worlds. Clara's reading glasses still sat on the coffee table beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. The kids had left their trail of destruction as usual, building blocks scattered near the bookshelf, a forgotten juice box on its side by the recliner, those small artifacts of family life that I had stopped noticing years ago. But tonight, in the dim light, they seemed to glow with significance, like evidence of a life I was borrowing rather than living. Julian shifted beside me, adjusting his position in that restless way he had. I watched him from the corner of my eye. This man who had somehow found his way back into my life after 23 years of absence. The boy I had known in college had grown into someone softer around the edges, more settled in his skin than I could ever hope to be. He moved through the world with an ease I envied, unencumbered by the weight of expectations that had shaped every decision I had made since graduation. The movie droned on, actors moving through their prescribed motions on the screen. I wasn't following the plot. My attention had narrowed to the space between Julian and me, to the way he breathed, to the occasional comment he would make about the terrible dialogue or the obvious plot twist. His voice had always been like that, warm and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world to say whatever needed saying. Then, without warning, without any preamble or hesitation, he let his head drift sideways until it came to rest against my shoulder. The contact was gentle, almost weightless, but it sent a shock through my entire body. I stopped breathing. The sound from the television faded into white noise, replaced by the thunderous beating of my heart. Every nerve ending came alive at once, hyper-aware of the warmth radiating from where his temple touched the fabric of my shirt. His hair was soft against my neck, and I could feel the slow rhythm of his breathing. I should have moved, should have shifted away, made some excuse about getting another beer or checking on the kids. Should have done any of the 1,000 things a married man does when faced with a moment that threatens to crack open everything he has built. Instead, I sat frozen, every muscle in my body rigid with the effort of not responding to the pull I felt toward him. My left hand, resting on my thigh, began to tremble. I wanted to lift it, to let my fingers find their way to his hair, to touch him in return. The urge was so strong it felt like physical pain, a longing that reached back through decades to a younger version of myself who had learned to bury such desires so deep they became background noise. But tonight, with Julian's head on my shoulder and the rest of the world reduced to shadows and silence, that buried part of me stirred to life. It rose up from wherever I had hidden it, insistent and undeniable, demanding acknowledgement after years of careful suppression. Julian's breathing deepened slightly, and I realized he might be falling asleep. The thought should have brought relief, an easy exit from this impossible moment. Instead, it filled me with something close to panic. I didn't want him to move. I wanted to stay suspended in this perfect, terrible intimacy forever, even as it threatened to destroy everything I thought I knew about myself. This was how it began. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the simple weight of another person's trust pressing against my shoulder in a darkened room while my family slept overhead. It was such a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone watching. Yet in that moment, I felt the first crack in the foundation of the life I had so carefully constructed, and I knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The morning came as mornings always did, with the harsh buzz of the alarm at 5:30 and the familiar weight of obligation settling over me before I was fully awake. I slipped from bed carefully, trying not to disturb Clara, though she rarely stirred anymore when I left for my early runs. The house felt different in those pre-dawn hours, emptied of the day's pretenses, just walls and furniture and the accumulated silence of 22 years of marriage. I moved through my routine with practiced efficiency. Shower, shave, coffee strong enough to burn away the lingering memory of Julian's head on my shoulder. The bathroom mirror reflected back a man I recognized but didn't always feel connected to. Salt and pepper at the temples now, lines around the eyes that spoke of responsibility rather than laughter, the kind of face people trusted with their mortgages and their children's college funds. By 7, I was backing out of the driveway in my reliable Honda, the same route to the office I had taken for the past 15 years. The suburbs unfolded around me in their orderly procession, sidewalks swept clean, lawns maintained, garbage cans positioned with military precision. This was the life I had chosen, or perhaps the life that had chosen me. Either way, I wore it like a well-tailored suit that had grown a size too small. At work, I was Nathaniel Hartwell, senior financial advisor, the man people came to when they needed someone steady to guide them through their biggest decisions. My office looked exactly as a financial advisor's office should look. Diplomas on the wall, family photos arranged just so, a bookshelf lined with volumes on investment strategy and retirement planning. I had built this image deliberately, year by year, client by client, until it became indistinguishable from who I was supposed to be. The day passed in its familiar rhythm of meetings and phone calls, spreadsheets and projections. I helped the Andersons refinance their home, walked Mrs. Chun through her retirement options, advised a young couple on their first investment portfolio. They trusted me because I represented stability, the kind of man who had figured out how to live successfully within the boundaries society had drawn. If only they knew how much effort it took to maintain that facade. Home by 6:15, I would find Clara in the kitchen, dinner already started, the children's homework spread across the dining room table. She would greet me with the same tired smile she had worn for years, and I would kiss her cheek in the same spot I always did, tasting the faint sweetness of her perfume mixed with the day's accumulated weariness. We had perfected this dance long ago, each step choreographed by habit rather than desire. Emma, our 15-year-old, would barely look up from her phone when I walked in, though she would dutifully answer my questions about school with the minimum number of words required. Michael, 2 years younger, still had enough enthusiasm left to tell me about his soccer practice or the science project due next week. I listened and responded appropriately, playing the role of engaged father while part of my mind remained elsewhere. Dinner conversations revolved around schedules and logistics, who needed to be where and when, what bills were due, whether we should replace the washing machine or try to repair it one more time. Clara and I had become experts at filling the silence with these practical exchanges, avoiding the deeper questions that might reveal how little we actually had to say to each other anymore. The house itself seemed to echo with the weight of our accumulated years. The living room where Julian and I had sat the night before was the same room where we had opened Christmas presents for 2 decades, where the children had taken their first steps, where we had hosted birthday parties and anniversary dinners that felt more like performances than celebrations. Every piece of furniture told the story of who we were supposed to be, the responsible couple, the good parents, the pillars of the community. After the children retreated to their rooms and the dishes were cleaned and put away, Clara and I would settle into our respective corners of the evening. She would read her book, I would watch the news or scroll through emails on my laptop. Sometimes we would comment on what we were reading or watching, but more often we existed in parallel, 2 people sharing the same space, but living increasingly separate lives. It wasn't that Clara was unkind or that our marriage was marked by any particular cruelty. We had simply worn each other smooth over the years, like stones polished by decades of gentle contact until all the sharp edges were gone. We knew each other's routines and preferences, could predict each other's responses with disappointing accuracy. The passion that had once existed between us had faded so gradually that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had disappeared, only that its absence had become as familiar as its presence once was. This was the life I had built, brick by careful brick, decision by responsible decision. It was a good life by any reasonable measure, stable, respectable, the kind of life my parents had wanted for me and their parents had wanted for them. I had a home people admired, children who were healthy and smart, a career that provided well for my family. I should have been content, maybe even happy. But Julian's return had introduced something I hadn't felt in years, the possibility that life could still surprise me. When his first text arrived 3 months ago, that simple message about catching up after all these years, it had broken through the careful routine of my days like sunlight through a crack in heavy curtains. Suddenly, there was something to anticipate, something that existed outside the predictable rhythm of work and home and obligation. Our friendship had rekindled with surprising ease, as if the 23 years since college were just a pause rather than a fundamental break. He would text at random times during the day, sometimes with a memory from our shared past, sometimes with an observation about the present that made me smile despite myself. These small interruptions became the moments I most looked forward to, tiny sparks of spontaneity in an otherwise carefully controlled existence. And now, after last night, after that moment on the couch, when he had let his guard down enough to rest his head on my shoulder, I knew that whatever this was between us had moved beyond the safety of mere friendship. The careful life I had constructed felt suddenly fragile, like a house of cards that could be toppled by the slightest breath of wind. The text came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing the quarterly reports, my phone buzzing against the mahogany surface of my desk like an insect trying to escape. Julian's name appeared on the screen, a name I hadn't seen there in over 2 decades, and for a moment I stared at it, as if it might disappear if I blinked. It's been too long. Let's catch up. 7 words that managed to upend the careful equilibrium of my day. I read the message 3 times before setting the phone aside, trying to return my attention to the spreadsheet in front of me. But the numbers blurred together, meaningless columns of data that couldn't compete with the sudden rush of memory his name had triggered. Julian McConnell. We had been inseparable during our junior and senior years at State, the kind of friendship that felt essential, fundamental to who we were becoming as men. We had shared everything, late-night conversations about books and philosophy, weekend camping trips, the particular intimacy that comes from being young and convinced that the world is vast and full of possibility. After graduation, he had taken a job overseas, something with an environmental nonprofit that would take him to places whose names I couldn't pronounce. I had stayed local, taken the safe path, married Clara 6 months later. Over the years, we had exchanged Christmas cards sporadically, brief updates about promotions and marriages and children. But real contact had faded, the way friendships do when geography and circumstance pull people in different directions. I had assumed that chapter of my life was closed, filed away with my college textbooks and the naive optimism of my early 20s. Now he was back. According to his message, he had moved to town 3 weeks ago, had taken a position with the Regional Conservation District. He was living in one of the renovated apartments downtown, the kind of place I drove past on my way to client meetings, but never really noticed. I waited until evening to respond, crafting and deleting several messages before settling on something appropriately casual. Good to hear from you. Would love to catch up. We arranged to meet at O'Malley's, the pub near the old courthouse that Clara and I had visited maybe twice in all our years together. That first evening stretched across 3 hours without either of us noticing. Julian looked older, of course, but he wore the years well. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of time spent squinting into foreign sunlight. But his laugh was exactly the same, that easy, unguarded sound that had always made me feel like I was part of some conspiracy of humor that only we understood. He told me about his years abroad, projects in Costa Rica and Peru, months spent in villages where English was a luxury and running water was a recent innovation. He spoke about these experiences with the same enthusiasm he had once brought to our college discussions about Kerouac and environmental activism, as if he had somehow managed to live the life we had all imagined for ourselves at 21. I found myself talking about things I rarely discussed with anyone, Not just the surface details of work and family, but the questions that kept me awake some nights. What did it mean to live a good life? Had we made the right choices, or simply the expected ones? Julian listened in that way he always had, fully present, asking questions that revealed he was actually thinking about what I was saying rather than just waiting for his turn to speak. When we finally left the pub, he suggested we do it again soon. Maybe next week, he said. I have a decent television and terrible taste in movies. The invitation felt casual, almost throwaway, but I found myself looking forward to it with an intensity that surprised me. The second evening was at his apartment, a space that felt temporary despite his having lived there for over a month. Boxes still lined the walls, and his furniture consisted mainly of items that looked like they had been acquired from necessity rather than any particular aesthetic vision. But it felt alive in a way my house never did, full of the accumulated artifacts of a life lived deliberately. Photographs from his travels, books with worn spines, a guitar that showed signs of regular use. We ordered pizza and watched some action movie that was terrible in exactly the way we both enjoyed, making commentary throughout that was funnier than anything happening on screen. It reminded me of our college years, when we would spend entire evenings dissecting films and arguing about their merits with the kind of passionate intensity that only young men can bring to subjects that ultimately don't matter. By the third visit, it had become a pattern. Friday nights, when Clara would retreat to her book and the children to their rooms, I would drive across town to Julian's apartment. Sometimes we would walk to the corner bar first. Sometimes we would start with takeout and a movie. But always, we would end up talking until late, the conversation ranging across decades and continents, picking up threads from our shared past and weaving them into the present. Julian had a way of asking questions that cut through the polite surface of things. He wanted to know not just what I did for work, but whether I found it meaningful. Not just how many years Clara and I had been married, but whether we still made each other laugh. He never pushed, never pried in a way that felt invasive. But his curiosity had a quality that made me want to be more honest than I was accustomed to being. There was something dangerous about these evenings, though I couldn't have articulated exactly what the danger was. It wasn't anything he said or did specifically. It was more the way he inhabited his own skin, the ease with which he moved through the world unburdened by the weight of other people's expectations. He had never married, never felt the need to justify that choice to anyone. He lived alone not out of loneliness, but out of preference, surrounded by books and music and the freedom to follow whatever impulse struck him. I found myself envying that freedom even as I recognized how foreign it was to my own experience. My life had been shaped by a series of reasonable decisions, each one narrowing the field of possibility until I arrived at this moment. Mid-40s, successful by conventional measures, but increasingly aware of roads not taken. The invitations kept coming. Another movie night, another beer on the porch when the weather was warm enough, another excuse to extend the evening just a little longer. Each suggestion felt casual when he made it, but to me they carried weight, became the bright spots in a week otherwise filled with familiar obligations. Julian's presence in my life was like water finding its way into a crack in stone, gradual but inexorable, changing the fundamental structure of things in ways that weren't immediately visible but were nonetheless profound. I began to measure the days not by their own merits, but by their proximity to Friday evening, to the next opportunity to sit across from him and remember what it felt like to be fully engaged with another person. It was during one of these evenings, perhaps our 8th or 9th, that something shifted between us. We were watching some thriller he had picked up at the grocery store, the kind of movie that requires no real attention, just background noise for conversation. Clara had gone to bed early as usual, the children were asleep, and the house had settled into its familiar nighttime quiet. And then, without warning or preamble, Julian let his head drift sideways until it came to rest against my shoulder. After that night on the couch, I began living two lives with a precision that surprised me. The external life continued exactly as before, alarm at 5:30, coffee while scanning the morning news, the same commute through the same suburban streets lined with the same carefully maintained lawns. I drove Emma to her debate team meetings and Michael to soccer practice, attended parent-teacher conferences and neighborhood association meetings, smiled at the appropriate moments, and offered opinions on matters I had stopped caring about years ago. But underneath this performance of normalcy, something fundamental had shifted. The touch that had lasted perhaps 15 minutes had rewired something essential in my nervous system. I found myself replaying those moments with an obsessive attention to detail that would have been embarrassing if anyone could have witnessed it. The weight of Julian's head against my shoulder, the way his breathing had deepened as he relaxed into sleep, the impossible softness of his hair against my neck. These sensations had burned themselves into my memory with a clarity that made the rest of my life feel blurred by comparison. At work, I would catch myself staring out the window during client meetings, my mind drifting to the way Julian had looked when he finally stirred awake that night. The brief moment of disorientation followed by something that might have been embarrassment or might have been something else entirely. I began analyzing every interaction we had shared with the intensity of an archaeologist examining artifacts, searching for clues I might have missed, signs that what I was feeling might not be entirely one-sided. The transformation was subtle enough that Clara noticed nothing, or if she did, attributed it to the usual midlife restlessness that occasionally overtook men my age. I continued to kiss her cheek when I came home from work, continued to ask about her day, and offer appropriate responses to her concerns about the children's grades or the neighbors' too loud music. But I felt like an actor who had forgotten his motivation, going through the motions of a role I could no longer quite believe in. Julian's texts became the bright spots in my otherwise muted days. They arrived at random times, a photo of something amusing he had seen on his lunch break, a comment about a book he was reading, occasionally a memory from our college years that would make me smile despite myself. I found myself checking my phone with an frequency that felt adolescent, that little thrill of anticipation when I saw his name on the screen becoming as addictive as caffeine. Our Friday evening routine continued, but the dynamic had shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. We still watched movies and made jokes about the terrible dialogue, still talked about work and books and the peculiar politics of small-town life. But now there were undercurrents to everything we said, layers of meaning that hung in the air between us like smoke. Julian's laugh seemed louder, more deliberate. Our silences stretched longer, filled with the weight of things neither of us was quite ready to acknowledge. He had a way of looking at me now that felt different, more direct, as if he was trying to read something written in a language he was still learning to understand. Sometimes I would catch him watching me while I talked, his attention focused not just on my words, but on my face, my hands, the way I moved through his small apartment. These moments of scrutiny should have made me uncomfortable, but instead they made me feel more present in my own skin than I had in years. There were moments when the space between us seemed to vibrate with possibility. Julian would reach for the remote at the same time I did, our hands brushing briefly before one of us pulled away. He would lean closer to point out something on his laptop screen, close enough that I could smell his shampoo and feel the warmth radiating from his skin. These accidental intimacies felt anything but accidental, charged with an electricity that made the air in the room feel thin and dangerous. I began driving past his apartment building during my lunch hour, telling myself I was simply taking a different route back to the office. Sometimes his car would be in the parking lot, sometimes not, but the knowledge of his proximity became a kind of compass that oriented my movements through the day. I would find excuses to go downtown for errands I didn't really need to run, hoping for the possibility of an accidental encounter that never materialized but somehow satisfied something in me just to attempt. The guilt came in waves, usually late at night when Clara slept beside me and I lay staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations with Julian and wondering what kind of man I was becoming. I had built my entire adult life on a foundation of reliability and responsibility, had prided myself on being the kind of person others could count on. Now I felt like I was harboring a secret that could demolish everything I had worked to create, and the most terrifying part was how little that possibility seemed to bother me. Julian never pushed, never said anything that couldn't be interpreted as simple friendship between two men who had reconnected after years apart. But I sensed an awareness in him, a recognition that something had changed between us that night on the couch. He would sometimes pause mid-sentence when our eyes met, as if he had forgotten what he was going to say. His invitations became more frequent, more creative, a new restaurant he wanted to try, a concert at the community center, a hiking trail he had discovered on the outskirts of town. Each of these excursions felt like a small rebellion against the life I had constructed for myself. I would lie to Clara about working late or meeting with clients, excuses that came surprisingly easily and bothered me less than they should have. The deception felt necessary, a way of protecting something fragile and important that was growing between Julian and me, something that couldn't survive the harsh light of scrutiny or explanation. I was being remade, piece by piece, by forces I had no control over and wasn't sure I wanted to resist. The careful boundaries I had spent decades establishing were dissolving like sugar in rain, and I found myself wondering who I might become if I stopped trying to hold them in place. Julian's presence in my life had awakened hungers I had forgotten I possessed, had reminded me that it was possible to feel excitement about something as simple as a text message or as complicated as the way another person's laugh could make my chest feel tight with an emotion I couldn't name. The man I had been for the past 20 years, the responsible husband, the devoted father, the trusted financial advisor, felt increasingly like a costume I put on each morning, necessary for navigating the world, but no longer quite fitting the shape of who I was becoming. And somewhere beneath the guilt and confusion, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that my life might still surprise me. The revelation came on a Thursday evening in early June, when the late spring air was soft enough to leave the windows open and the sound of distant lawnmowers created a backdrop of suburban tranquility. Julian had suggested we skip the movie and sit on his small porch instead, nursing beers and watching the light fade from the sky. It was the kind of evening that felt suspended outside of time, warm and unhurried, with no particular agenda beyond existing in each other's company. We had been talking about nothing consequential: work frustrations, a book he was reading, the peculiar habits of his downstairs neighbor who played the same jazz album every evening at exactly 7 o'clock. The conversation had the easy rhythm of old friends, punctuated by comfortable silences and the occasional laugh that felt like a small gift exchanged between us. I don't remember exactly what prompted it, only that I found myself talking about the ways I had disappointed myself over the years. It was the kind of confession that alcohol sometimes loosens from deep places, though I wasn't particularly drunk, just relaxed enough to let my guard down. I told him about the environmental law practice I had once imagined for myself, the poetry I had written in college and abandoned, the gradual way I had settled into a life that felt safe rather than meaningful. I suppose I was being self-deprecating in that way men of my generation do, deflecting any real vulnerability with humor that isn't quite humor. I made some joke about becoming exactly the kind of person my 20-year-old self would have found insufferably boring, a middle-aged man who got excited about mortgage rates and new lawn fertilizer. Julian didn't laugh. Instead, he reached across the small space between our chairs and placed his hand over mine. The contact was deliberate, unmistakable. Not the accidental brush of fingers reaching for the same object, not the casual touch of friendship, but something intentional and weighted with meaning. His hand was warm against mine, his fingers curling slightly around my knuckles, and I felt that same electric shock that had run through me the night he had rested his head on my shoulder. I should have pulled away, should have made some joke to diffuse the moment, should have stood up and suggested we go inside or call it an early night. Instead, I sat perfectly still, staring at our joined hands as if they belonged to other people, as if I was watching this moment unfold from a great distance. The air around us became thick, heavy with everything neither of us had said over the past months. I could hear my own breathing, could feel my pulse hammering in my throat. The suburban evening continued around us, children's voices from a nearby yard, the hum of air conditioners kicking on as the day's heat lingered, but we might as well have been alone in the universe. Julian's thumb moved across the back of my hand in a gesture so gentle it was almost imperceptible, and when I finally found the courage to look up at his face, his eyes were already fixed on mine with an intensity that made me feel exposed in ways I had forgotten were possible. "You've always known, haven't you?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air between us like a confession and a question and an invitation all at once. I knew immediately what he meant, though it was a knowledge I had spent decades refusing to acknowledge even to myself. The understanding that had lived in the space between us since college, the recognition that had flickered to life in stolen glances and conversations that ran too late into the night, the awareness that some connections transcend the boundaries of friendship even when we lack the courage to name them. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, I felt something fundamental shift inside me, like a lock finally turning after years of being jammed. The careful architecture of denial I had constructed around my feelings began to crumble, and in its place rose a truth so obvious and terrifying that I wondered how I had managed to avoid seeing it for so long. The love I had buried so deep I had convinced myself it was extinct hadn't died at all. It had simply been waiting, patient and persistent, for this moment when it could no longer be ignored. It had a face now, Julian's face, lined with years and experience, but essentially unchanged from the young man I had fallen in love with without understanding what was happening to me. It had a voice, the same warm timbre that had always made me feel like I was hearing something meant specifically for my ears. It had a history, woven through decades of Christmas cards and half-remembered dreams, and the ache of wondering what might have been. It had always been Julian. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of awkwardness. It was the silence of recognition, of two people finally acknowledging something that had been true for longer than either of us had been willing to admit. I felt tears gathering at the corners of my eyes, though whether they were tears of relief or terror or simple overwhelm, I couldn't say. Julian's hand remained on mine, steady and warm, an anchor in a moment that felt like it might sweep me away entirely. I realized that this was what I had been running from all these years, not the possibility of scandal or social disapproval, though those fears were real enough, but the sheer magnitude of feeling something this deeply after convincing myself I was incapable of such intensity. The man I had been that morning, driving to work with his coffee and his NPR and his carefully maintained schedule, felt like a stranger now. In his place sat someone I barely recognized, but somehow knew intimately, someone who had been sleeping under the surface of my life for decades, waiting for permission to breathe. I still couldn't speak, couldn't trust my voice not to break entirely, but I didn't pull my hand away. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself feel the full weight of wanting something with every fiber of my being. Let myself acknowledge the hunger that had been gnawing at me from the inside for most of my adult life. This was the revelation, not just that I loved Julian, though that truth was staggering enough, but that I was capable of love this fierce and consuming and transformative. That despite all the years of settling and compromising and choosing safety over passion, some essential part of me had remained intact, had been waiting for exactly this moment to remind me who I might still become. The truth, once acknowledged, became impossible to ignore. In the days following that evening on Julian's porch, I moved through my life like a man walking underwater, every familiar gesture requiring conscious effort. The simple act of kissing Clara goodbye in the morning felt like a betrayal of something fundamental, though I couldn't say whether I was betraying her or myself or the man whose hand had covered mine in the gathering darkness. At breakfast, I found myself staring at the newspaper without reading it, the words blurring together into meaningless shapes while my mind replayed Julian's question over and over. "You've always known, haven't you?" The certainty in his voice had shattered something I hadn't even realized I was protecting, and now I was left to navigate a world where everything looked the same but felt utterly transformed. Clara began to notice my distraction in the way that spouses do, with small comments disguised as casual observations. "You seem tired lately," she would say. Or are you feeling all right? You've been so quiet. I would respond with the expected reassurances, blame work stress, or mention that I might be coming down with something. But I could see her watching me with the particular attention of someone who senses that the familiar rhythms of their life have shifted. I started avoiding her eyes during dinner, focusing instead on cutting my food or helping Michael with his homework, anything that would keep me from having to meet her gaze directly. Clara had always been perceptive, one of the qualities that had drawn me to her in the first place, and I knew that if she looked too carefully, she would see something I wasn't ready to explain. The children seemed oblivious to the change, wrapped up in their own teenage concerns and social dramas. Emma was preparing for her driver's test and spoke of little else, while Michael had discovered a passion for skateboarding that required detailed explanations of tricks I pretended to understand. Their self-absorption felt like a mercy, one less layer of deception I had to maintain. But Clara's scrutiny intensified as the days passed. She would pause in the middle of conversations, watching me with a puzzled expression as if trying to solve a problem she couldn't quite identify. I caught her studying me over her coffee cup in the morning, her book forgotten in her lap, while she searched my face for clues to what had changed. The confrontation came on a Sunday evening, after the children had retreated to their rooms and the house had settled into its familiar end-of-weekend quiet. We were cleaning up the dinner dishes in the automatic way of couples who have performed this ritual thousands of times, moving around each other with practiced efficiency. But when I reached past her to put a plate in the dishwasher, she turned suddenly and caught my wrist. The touch was gentle but firm, impossible to ignore. When I looked at her face, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Not anger, not suspicion, but a kind of sad knowledge that told me she had already arrived at conclusions I wasn't prepared to discuss. "We need to talk," she said, and the words carried the weight of an ending, though neither of us had spoken it yet. We sat at the kitchen table where we had shared thousands of meals, where we had helped the children with homework and planned vacations, and discussed the mundane details that make up a marriage. But tonight it felt like foreign territory, a place where we were about to say things that would change everything between us forever. Clara folded her hands in front of her and looked directly at me with the same steady gaze that had once made me feel known and loved. Now it felt like an interrogation I was destined to fail. "Is there someone else?" she asked, and the simplicity of the question was devastating in its accuracy. I opened my mouth to deny it, to offer some explanation that would preserve the fiction we had been living, but the words wouldn't come. The silence stretched between us, growing heavier with each second that passed, until it became an answer in itself. Her face didn't change, but I saw something die behind her eyes, some last hope that whatever she had sensed was wrong. We sat there looking at each other across the table that had anchored our life together. Two people who had shared a home and children and 22 years of accumulated history, and I felt the weight of everything I was about to destroy. I tried to explain that it wasn't what she thought, that nothing had happened, that I was confused and struggling with feelings I didn't understand. But even as I spoke, I could hear how hollow the words sounded, how inadequate they were to contain the magnitude of what I was feeling. The choice spread out before me with brutal clarity. To choose Julian meant dismantling everything I had built. This house with its carefully maintained facade, this marriage that had become more habit than passion, this identity as a reliable man who honored his commitments. It meant disappointing my children, devastating a woman who had never done anything worse than grow distant over the years. It meant becoming the kind of person who abandoned his responsibilities for the sake of feelings he couldn't even properly name. But to deny Julian, to return to the life I had been living before that night on his porch, meant suffocating under the weight of what I now knew was possible. It meant spending the rest of my days wondering what might have been, carrying the knowledge that I had chosen safety over truth, obligation over the kind of love that made everything else feel like shadows. Clara was still watching me, waiting for an explanation that wouldn't come. Finally, she asked the question that I realized I had been dreading most. "Do you love him?" The pronoun hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that made my chest tight. Somehow she had intuited not just that there was someone else, but the fundamental nature of what that meant. Perhaps she had always known, the way spouses sometimes do, that the person they married was keeping essential parts of themselves hidden. "I think I've always loved him," I said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff. They were the most honest thing I had said in years, maybe decades. They contained within them not just the admission of my feelings for Julian, but the acknowledgement of a life lived in partial truth, of a marriage built on the foundation of who I thought I should be rather than who I actually was. Clara's face crumpled slightly, not with surprise, but with the pain of having her worst fears confirmed. But there was something else there too, relief, perhaps, at finally having a name for the distance that had grown between us, an explanation for the gradual erosion of intimacy that we had both felt but never discussed. The words hung between us, impossible to take back, freeing and ruinous in equal measure. I had spoken a truth that would reshape everything that came after, that would require us both to rebuild our understanding of who we were and what we owed each other. There was no going back now, no way to pretend that this conversation hadn't happened or that the revelation it contained could be ignored. In the silence that followed, I could hear the house settling around us, the familiar sounds of a home that would soon become something else entirely. The house emptied itself gradually, the way endings do when they unfold over weeks rather than moments. Clara moved with a quiet efficiency that was more devastating than anger would have been, packing boxes with the same methodical care she brought to everything else. She took only what was hers, the books she had collected over the years, the jewelry from her grandmother, half the photographs from albums we had filled together during happier times. The children absorbed the news with the peculiar resilience of teenagers, asking practical questions about living arrangements and custody schedules while carefully avoiding the deeper implications of what was happening. Emma would spend weekdays with Clara in the apartment she had found across town, weekends with me. Michael, ever the diplomat, declared that he just wanted everyone to be happy, though I could see in his eyes that he didn't quite understand how that was possible anymore. I helped Clara load her car on a Tuesday morning, carrying boxes that contained the accumulated artifacts of our shared life. Neither of us spoke much during the process, but there was a strange tenderness to it, the careful attention of two people dismantling something precious even though it could no longer be sustained. When she drove away, she didn't look back, and I found myself grateful for that small mercy. The house felt different afterward, not empty exactly but hollowed out, like a shell holding the echo of something that had once been vital. Our wedding rings sat on the kitchen counter where Clara had left them, two small circles of gold that had once represented promises we believed we could keep. I stared at them for a long time before finally putting them away in the drawer with the other items too loaded with history to discard, but too painful to display. I went through the motions of my remaining obligations. Work continued, client meetings required my attention, the children still needed rides and homework help and the illusion that their world hadn't fundamentally shifted. But I felt like I was performing a role I no longer believed in, saying lines I had memorized long ago, but which no longer held any real meaning. Julian gave me space during those first weeks, seeming to understand without being told that I needed time to navigate the aftermath of choices that couldn't be undone. He sent brief texts occasionally, nothing demanding or urgent, just gentle reminders that he was still there when I was ready. His patience felt like a gift I wasn't sure I deserved. The evening I finally went to him, I stood outside his apartment building for 20 minutes before finding the courage to climb the stairs. My hands shook as I knocked on his door, and when it opened to reveal his familiar face, I felt something break open inside me that had been held closed for decades. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate my arrival as some kind of victory. Instead, he simply stepped aside to let me enter, his eyes holding mine with a gravity that acknowledged the weight of what this moment meant. The air between us felt fragile, charged with possibility, but also with the recognition that we were both different people than we had been even weeks before. We sat on his couch, the same place where this had all begun, where he had first rested his head on my shoulder and cracked open the carefully constructed wall around my heart. But tonight felt different, not electric with discovery, but quiet with acceptance. There was no urgency, no need to rush toward anything we weren't ready for. Julian reached for the remote and found a movie, something old and familiar that neither of us needed to follow too closely. The television cast its blue glow across the room just as it had that first night, but now I understood what I had been too afraid to see then. That this was where I belonged, in this space between friendship and something deeper, with this man who had somehow always known who I was beneath the roles I had learned to play. When Julian leaned against me, letting his head find its familiar place on my shoulder, I didn't freeze this time. Instead, I let my hand rise to touch his hair, finally giving in to the impulse I had fought for so long. The gesture felt natural, inevitable, like coming home to a place I had been traveling toward my entire life without knowing it. I breathed deeply for what felt like the first time in years, filling my lungs with air that didn't taste of compromise or suppressed longing. The man I had been that morning, the one who had kissed his wife goodbye and driven to work and pretended that life was something that happened to other people, felt like a stranger now. In his place sat someone I was still learning to recognize, someone who had finally stopped running from the truth of what he needed. This was not the ending I had imagined for myself at 20 or 30 or even 45. It was messier than that, more complicated, shot through with loss and regret alongside the relief and possibility. But as I sat there with Julian's weight against me and the future stretching out undefined and uncertain, I felt something I had almost forgotten was possible, the quiet joy of being exactly where I was supposed to be.